In a courtroom packed with spectators, Jasmine Crockett faced a system that wanted to erase her. The evidence against her had vanished, and Judge Anthony Trenga had labeled her a danger to justice. But what happened next left the entire nation stunned. This wasn't just another trial. This was the story of a woman who refused to surrender and shattered everything they tried to hide. But the question is, why were they so afraid of her truth? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The morning sky over Alexandria, Virginia, was the color of bruised steel, as if the heavens themselves knew a battle was about to be waged inside the towering federal courthouse. News vans lined the streets like vultures, their satellite dishes aimed hungrily at the marble steps where history was about to unfold. Reporters barked updates into microphones, cameramen jockeyed for position, and uniformed officers held back crowds that swelled with every passing hour. Inside the courthouse, the air crackled with something more than anticipation. It was judgment, already forming, already poised to strike. Across every television screen in America, the headline burned in red. Jasmine Crockett faces federal trial for obstruction, career on the line. Some called her a patriot. Others spat her name like an insult. From barrooms to boardrooms, living rooms to state houses, the nation was split, waiting, watching, ready to either cheer her downfall or mourn her sacrifice. And at the center of it all stood Judge Anthony Trenga, the immovable rock of the Eastern District, a man who wore his 72 years in icy detachment like a second robe. Today, he would be the wall Jasmine Crockett had to scale or shatter. Inside the courtroom, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as Jasmine Crockett stepped through the heavy oak doors, every click of her heels echoing like a drumbeat of defiance against polished marble floors. Her suit was dark, almost too simple, but the way she carried herself made it look like armor. Around her, the murmurs were deafening, not loud in volume, but thick with judgment. Whispers of traitor, hisses of hero. She clutched a slim folder against her ribs, but it wasn't paperwork she held. It was everything. Her future, her reputation, her cause. Judge Trenga watched her from the bench with a stare sharpened by years of skepticism, his hand resting with calculated casualness on the gavel. Jasmine didn't flinch. Beneath the polished calm, her heart pounded against her ribs like a war drum, but her gaze remained steady, fixed, unblinking. One thought anchored her, clear as a bell cutting through fog. If I stay silent, they'll just keep doing this to others. The heavy doors thudded shut behind Jasmine, sealing her inside the arena where fate would be decided not by justice, but by power cloaked in ceremony. The murmurs died instantly, swallowed by the thick electric air. And in that silence, Trenga's voice cut like a blade across stone. I will not allow this courtroom to become a stage for political theater, he declared, each syllable falling with the slow, deliberate cadence of a man who wanted his words to sink deep and leave bruises. Nor will I permit it to be twisted into a pulpit for moral lectures by those, he let the words hang, cold and heavy, who do not understand the law they pretend to uphold. His gaze never wavered from Jasmine as he spoke, the implication as clear as a slap across the face. Around the courtroom, heads turned, breaths caught in throats. Even the walls seemed to inch closer, pressing down with invisible hands. Trenga leaned back slightly, as if granting himself the full power of the silence he had created, and then twisted the knife deeper. The law is not a forum for personal grievances, he continued, his voice now silky with disdain. Nor is it a canvas for painting over ancient injuries passed down through generations. A few gasps rippled through the gallery, too soft to challenge the gavel's grip. But Jasmine heard them. The crack in the facade, the wound reopened. She stood perfectly still, refusing to let the insult stain her composure, though inside every fiber of her being burned against the cold injustice. Trenga's words weren't just a dismissal of her case. They were a dismissal of her very existence, of every scar carved into the skin of her history. For a long moment, Jasmine said nothing. The silence that followed wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Silence like the drawing back of a bowstring. She let the judge's words echo in the still air. Let them settle into every ear like a toxin. She wasn't going to meet poison with noise. She was going to meet it with something far more dangerous: clarity. Her heart thundered beneath her blazer, but her face remained calm, almost serene, like someone who had walked through fire and now knew exactly how hot truth could burn. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her eyes to the bench. And then she spoke, softly, but in a voice that landed like a hammer wrapped in silk. "And if those injuries you dismiss so easily," she began, her tone even, laced with gravity, "happen to be true, then is it the truth itself that this court finds so offensive?" Her words, unhurried and razor-sharp, seemed to freeze the air mid-breath. A chill swept across the room, not from fear, but recognition. The gallery, once leaning back in safe observation, now leaned forward, pulled by the gravity of what had just been said. Trenga didn't answer. He couldn't. His face remained impassive, but something behind his eyes faltered, a flicker of discomfort that no robe could hide. Jasmine held her gaze, unyielding, not as a woman on trial, but as a witness to something greater than herself. The moment a system was forced to look at its own reflection and blink. The silence Jasmine left hanging in the courtroom was not just a void. It was a doorway, swinging open into the memory of how she had come to stand here in the first place. As she held her gaze steady on the bench, another scene played behind her eyes, unbidden but burning, as vivid as a wound that had never truly healed. It hadn't started with anger. It hadn't even started with courage. It had started, like so many stories of injustice, with a quiet knock at the back door of her conscience. It was a bitter night in Washington, D.C., the kind where the cold didn't just bite at your skin, it sank into your bones, made every breath feel like drawing glass into your lungs. Jasmine had just finished a late meeting about local housing reform, her mind still swimming with half-formed strategies and exhaustion, when she noticed him, a figure standing half-hidden under a flickering street lamp in the empty parking lot. He didn't wave. He didn't call her name. He just waited, as if daring her to choose whether to approach. Every instinct in her body warned her to keep walking, but something in the way he stood, rigid, desperate, almost vibrating with urgency, made her stop. He moved fast, his hood shadowing his face, and pressed something cold and metallic into her palm. A small, battered external hard drive, scratched at the edges like it had lived 1,000 lives. His hand lingered a second longer than necessary, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was so low she almost didn't catch it. "This isn't just paperwork," he said. "It's blood. It's bones. They're covering it up. Don't let them." And before she could even respond, he turned and disappeared into the wet, black city, leaving only the smell of rain and something heavier behind him. Fear. That night, Jasmine sat alone at her kitchen table, the hard drive between her hands like a loaded gun she hadn't asked for. The rain tapped against the windows, each drop ticking like a clock running out of time. She plugged it into her laptop with fingers that refused to steady, bracing herself without even knowing what for. The screen bloomed to life, filling with folders labeled in dry, bureaucratic language. Program audit, facility reports, work program evaluations. Innocuous names that masked the horror inside. With every click, Jasmine felt the world tilt further off its axis. She saw photographs first, rows of men, mostly black and brown, crammed into cells built for half their number, their faces hollow with hunger and hopelessness. She read emails between executives laughing about maximizing labor potential from nonviolent, low-cost detainees. She stared at doctored spreadsheets where injuries, illnesses, and even deaths had been scrubbed out like stains on a ledger. And there, hidden deeper inside a restricted access folder, she found the final, damning proof, side-by-side copies of the real facility reports and the falsified versions sent to Congress. In black and white, undeniable. The truth buried under signatures and lies. She sat back in her chair, dizzy, clutching the edges of the table to stop herself from sliding into the terror, clawing at her chest. This wasn't just corruption, it was calculated, industrialized cruelty, a machine fueled by profit and protected by silence. And now, by holding that drive, Jasmine knew she had crossed a line from which there was no return. She could have turned it over quietly. She could have walked away, claiming ignorance, saving her career, her safety, her peace. Nobody would have blamed her. Nobody would have even known. But she would have known. And some truths once seen do not let you look away. The decision wasn't heroic. It wasn't even brave in the way people later tried to paint it. It was simply inevitable. Jasmine didn't sleep that night. She sat at her desk as the hours bled into dawn, staring at the damning evidence, the faces of the men imprisoned by a system too broken to pretend anymore. And when the first rays of sun broke over the horizon, dull and cold, she made her choice. Not with speeches, not with fanfare. She copied the files to a secure server. She encrypted duplicates. She wrote a simple, blisteringly direct email to 3 journalists she trusted. No commentary, no editorializing, just the files, the raw truth. And then with a steady hand and a heart hammering like a distant war drum, she pressed send. The moment Jasmine hit send, she knew she had crossed a threshold no one could unwalk. There was no dramatic music, no cinematic explosion, just the soft, almost pitiful click of the mouse, and then silence. The kind of silence that feels thick, suffocating, as if the very air knows something irreversible has happened. For a long time she didn't move. She sat at her kitchen table, the old laptop humming faintly in front of her, the external hard drive still plugged into its side like a lifeline, or a bomb. Outside, the rain had slowed to a whisper, the city retreating into an uneasy stillness. But inside Jasmine's apartment, the world had shifted on its axis. Fear didn't crash down all at once. It seeped into her veins, slow and cold, chilling her from the inside out. She gripped the sides of her chair, feeling the tremble in her own fingers, but forced herself to stay still. She needed to remember this moment, needed to remember what it felt like to choose truth over safety. By dawn, the first tremors had begun. Her phone buzzed once, then again, then in a steady, frantic rhythm, as if the world was trying to pull her back before it was too late. Unknown numbers, blocked calls, messages piling up like small, frantic warnings. She didn't answer. What was there to say? She had made her choice, and there would be no easy walk back through the fire she had started. By mid-morning, the media frenzy erupted like a dam breaking. Headlines crawled across the bottom of television screens. Federal whistleblower, documents leak, political fallout expected. Secret labor practices exposed in private prisons. The anchors said the words with tight smiles and careful tones, pretending neutrality, pretending that what they reported hadn't already been shaped by hands more powerful than their own. At first, they didn't name her. She was simply a source, an unnamed official, an insider with access. But Jasmine knew better. She knew how fast the machine could pivot when embarrassed. She knew how quickly admiration could curdle into blame. By the second day, her name was everywhere. Jasmine Crockett, splashed in bold letters across news sites, her photo clipped from a years-old campaign poster. Bright smile, hopeful eyes, now twisted into something reckless, dangerous, unstable. She endangered national security, they said. She violated federal protocols. She put lives at risk. They didn't mention the lives already crushed under the system she had exposed. They didn't mention the bruises, the broken families, the stolen years. Within 72 hours, she wasn't a whistleblower. She was a threat. And then came the knife to the heart. Judge Anthony Trenga, a name known to every journalist covering federal courts, broke his usual silence and called a press conference. Standing behind a podium, flanked by American flags, he delivered his judgment, not inside a courtroom, but on every television in the country. His voice was cool, polished, professional, but there was no mistaking the disdain coiling beneath the surface. It is a tragedy, he said, pausing for effect, when individuals, particularly those who should know better, mistake reckless endangerment for heroism. It is even more regrettable when people like Ms. Crockett, he let the words hang in the air, heavy, unmistakable, imagine themselves champions of justice while undermining the very structures that protect it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The condescension was a knife honed so sharp it barely needed force to cut. With a few words, he had painted her not as someone brave enough to face the truth, but as a foolish, dangerous child who didn't understand the world she was trying to change. Jasmine watched the broadcast from her living room, sitting cross-legged on the worn couch she'd bought when she first moved to D.C. She didn't throw the remote. She didn't scream at the screen. She didn't even look away. She made herself watch every second, let the words carve themselves deep. Because if she was going to fight, she needed to know exactly what she was fighting against. Not just the system, not just the lies, but the quiet, smug certainty of men like Trenga, who believed the system belonged to them, and that people like her should know better than to question it. Her heart beat hard against her ribs, not from fear anymore, but from something hotter, heavier, conviction. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't backing down. She hadn't chosen this fight because she thought it would be easy. She had chosen it because someone had to. And even if they called her reckless, even if they called her dangerous, even if they buried her name under a mountain of lies, she would not be the one who stayed silent. But no amount of headlines, no wall of televised outrage, and no carefully rehearsed condemnations could prepare them for what would happen once Jasmine Crockett walked back into that courtroom. Not as a victim, but as the living embodiment of a truth too dangerous to be ignored. The fire they tried to light under her name had not consumed her. If anything, it had forged her sharper, quieter, more dangerous. As Jasmine sat back down at the defendant's table, facing a courtroom packed with press, government attorneys, and stone-faced jurors, she knew the real battle hadn't even begun. The smear campaigns, the televised condemnations, those were merely the opening salvos. Here inside these walls, under these high, indifferent ceilings, was where they would try to finish her for good. But walls and ceilings meant nothing when the ground itself was already cracked. The government's first key witness was a former Department of Justice official, a seasoned compliance auditor named Gregory Hale, who walked stiffly to the stand as if his spine had been bolted into place. His face, normally expressionless, carried something else today, something brittle, strained at the edges. Jasmine noticed it instantly. So did the jury. When the prosecutor asked Hale to confirm that Jasmine's leak had compromised ongoing investigations, his voice wavered. Not much, but enough. He cleared his throat once, twice. Sweat prickled at his temples despite the courthouse air conditioning humming low and steady. When he finally spoke, what came out was not what the government had prepared for. I was instructed to alter my final reports, Hale said, his words halting, every syllable landing like a fist against the polished wood of the witness stand. Gasps rippled through the gallery, sharp and uncontrolled this time, and Judge Trenga banged his gavel for silence. But the silence that followed was a living thing now, thick and electric, trembling against the marble floors. Hale continued, voice gaining momentum, as if he had broken free from invisible chains. Sections were removed. Data about prisoner injuries and labor conditions was sanitized. I protested. I was overruled. He blinked rapidly, his hands clenching the sides of the witness box. I was told it was for national security. I was told, his voice cracked, I was told people like her wouldn't understand the bigger picture. A slow, deliberate turn of 100 heads landed on Jasmine. People like her. The words hung in the air like smoke that refused to dissipate. Jasmine rose to her feet instinctively, propelled by something too deep for thought. She turned to Judge Trenga, her voice steady, controlled, but pulsing with something raw underneath. Your Honor, I request the right to conduct an expanded cross-examination of the witness. Every lawyer in the room stiffened. It was a bold move, a dangerous one. Defendants didn't question witnesses directly. Not without permission, not without 1,000 technical obstacles. Trenga's eyes narrowed into slits. He leaned forward, each syllable cold enough to frost glass. You are not a lawyer in this courtroom, Ms. Crockett. You are a defendant. You will remain seated. For a heartbeat, Jasmine didn't move. She simply stared at him, her chin lifted, the set of her shoulders broadcasting a message no gavel could silence. She understood the game he was playing. He wasn't just denying her a legal right, he was denying her dignity, autonomy, agency. She sat back down slowly, obedient in form, but defiant in spirit. And then as the prosecutor moved to continue the questioning, she did something no one expected. No one except Jasmine herself. She rose again, without asking this time, her voice cutting clean across the courtroom like a blade through silk. "Mr. Hale," she said, turning not to the judge, but to the witness stand, "when you swore your oath today, you placed your hand on the Bible and promised to tell the truth. Is that correct?" The prosecutor objected immediately, sharp, frantic. But Trenga, perhaps sensing that silencing her now would only light an even bigger fire, hesitated. He held up a hand, signaling the courtroom into a strained, simmering quiet. Jasmine took a step closer, her heels echoing softly across the polished floor. Each footfall a quiet act of rebellion against the machinery grinding toward her destruction. Her voice was lower now, almost gentle, but in the way a slow tide can carry the force of a hurricane. "Let me ask you plainly, Mr. Hale. When you took that oath this morning, were you swearing loyalty to this court?" She paused, letting the words settle, then added, "Or were you swearing loyalty to your own conscience?" The courtroom froze. Time itself seemed to hold its breath. The jurors sat motionless, the gallery gripped by a tension so sharp it felt physical. Even the stenographer's fingers hovered for a beat too long above her keys. Hale's lips parted, closed, then parted again. The struggle was written across every line of his face. He looked not at the judge, not at the lawyers, but at Jasmine. And when he finally answered, his voice broke free of whatever chains still bound it. "I swore to my conscience," he said. His voice was rough with shame and something else, relief. A ripple moved through the room, not noise exactly, but movement, a collective human reaction too instinctive to be repressed. It wasn't outrage. It wasn't approval. It was recognition. Recognition that something real, something true had cracked through the shell of procedure and power games that usually smothered courtrooms like this one. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't need to. She merely nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of acknowledgement. Not victory, but solidarity. Judge Trenga banged his gavel again, harder this time, as if trying to reassert control over a courtroom that had, for one shattering moment, remembered it existed for truth, not for those who wielded power most skillfully. But no matter how loud he pounded that gavel, he couldn't unhear what had been said. The damage was done, and for the first time since the trial began, Jasmine Crockett wasn't the one on the defensive anymore. She was the one asking the questions that no system could easily answer. The cracks in the government's case were widening, but Jasmine knew that when powerful walls start to crumble, the first instinct of those inside isn't to surrender. It's to bury the evidence deeper and crush anyone still standing outside. The shift came with almost mechanical precision. 2 days after Gregory Hale's damning testimony, Jasmine's legal team filed a motion to introduce a critical piece of evidence, a report drafted by independent auditors confirming that her public statements about prisoner abuse were accurate and based on verifiable facts. The document had been logged into the court's discovery record, marked, sealed, and acknowledged by both parties. It was supposed to be a central pillar of her defense, but when the court clerk retrieved the file for review, it was gone. Not misfiled, not miscategorized, gone, like it had never existed at all. A hush fell over the courtroom as the defense scrambled, their faces flashing confusion, then alarm. Jasmine sat perfectly still at the defense table, watching the unfolding chaos with the unnerving calm of someone who had always known the game was rigged. It wasn't just a missing document anymore. It was a crack in the mask of power, splitting wider with every second Jasmine refused to look away. Her attorney rose to his feet, voice tight with restrained fury, requesting an immediate inquiry into the disappearance. Around the gallery, journalists leaned forward in their seats, sensing the faint, acrid scent of something bigger than a mere clerical error. A systemic error, a purposeful erasure. Judge Trenga adjusted his glasses with a slow, almost theatrical weariness, as if the very notion of impropriety in his courtroom was more tiresome than troubling. He tapped his gavel once, lightly, and said, "This court will not indulge baseless conspiracy theories." The words were sharp, clipped, designed to wound without leaving fingerprints. Jasmine's lawyer pressed again, citing legal precedent, citing procedure. But Trenga raised his hand and silenced him with a single imperious gesture. And then turning not just to the courtroom, but to the bank of cameras stationed like vultures in the rear, he spoke directly into the microphones. I have seen enough. Ms. Crockett is not here because she sought to uphold the law. She is here because she sought to manipulate it, weaponizing her race and her political station as a shield against accountability. The words fell like hammer blows, each syllable sharpened to draw blood. Not just from Jasmine, but from every invisible figure whose face the judge would never see, but whose lives her fight had touched. There was no immediate objection, no outcry, only the thick, stunned silence of a room that had witnessed something far worse than bias. It had witnessed contempt being dressed up as procedure. Jasmine sat there under the weight of it, her body rigid, her hands folded tightly enough in her lap that her knuckles went bloodless. She could feel every camera's eye drilling into her, cataloging her expression, waiting, always waiting, for the moment when she would cry, or rage, or break in a way that could be twisted against her. She didn't give them the satisfaction. Instead, she let the silence stretch. Let it grow so wide and heavy that even Judge Trenga, in his polished arrogance, shifted slightly on the bench. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, controlled, the kind of steady that only comes after you have buried your anger deep enough to make it into something far more dangerous. Maybe, she said, each word deliberate, scalpel sharp. You're not afraid of my position. She let the sentence dangle for a second, just long enough for the courtroom to lean closer, to listen harder. Maybe you're just not used to someone like me using it. Her voice didn't rise. She didn't need it to. It was the simplicity that made it devastating. The words rippled across the room, slicing through the carefully maintained decorum like a blade. On the prosecution bench, two junior attorneys exchanged quick, panicked glances. In the gallery, a few heads turned sharply toward the judge, as if to confirm that, yes, they had heard it too, and that maybe, just maybe, it was the most honest thing said all day. Judge Trenga's jaw tightened so imperceptibly, it would have gone unnoticed by anyone less trained than Jasmine to catch such betrayals of control. He didn't respond. He couldn't, because to answer her would have been to dignify the truth she had just laid bare. But sometimes the truth doesn't just silence a courtroom, it summons new truths from the shadows, truths that no judge's gavel and no government silence can hold back forever. The courtroom had barely settled back into an uneasy stillness when the doors at the back creaked open again, not with ceremony, but with the slow, grinding resistance of a hinge bearing more weight than it wanted to carry. Heads turned. Conversations stuttered into silence. For a second, no one moved, as if unsure whether they were witnessing a disruption or a deliverance. Then he stepped forward. A man in his 60s, suit rumpled, face pale but set with grim determination. A small black USB drive clutched tightly in his right hand, as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to the ground. The clerk rushed toward him, whispering urgently, but the man shook his head once, sharply, and kept walking. His shoes clicked against the marble floor with a rhythm that sounded dangerously close to a drumbeat. By the time he reached the bar separating the public seating from the courtroom floor, murmurs had risen into a hum. Reporters lifting their cameras, lawyers leaning across tables. Judge Trenga leaning back slightly in his chair, with a frown carving deep lines across his face. I have evidence, the man said, voice steady enough to cut through the chaos without shouting. Evidence, a word more dangerous in that room than any accusation. The defense attorney for Jasmine rose quickly, sensing the seismic shift. Jasmine herself turned slowly, her body stiff, every nerve braced against the next blow. But what she saw in the man's face wasn't hostility. It was something far rarer. It was guilt. Permission was hastily granted. The man, later identified as a former deputy compliance officer for the Department of Justice, was sworn in. He approached the bench, his hand trembling only slightly as he handed the USB drive to the court clerk, who looked at it like it might detonate. Judge Trenga signaled for the contents to be projected on the courtroom's evidence screen. The first email blinked into existence. Then another, then another. Rows upon rows of internal DOJ correspondence, stamped and dated, their headers screaming authenticity no one could dispute. The contents were worse than anyone had expected. Crockett thinks she can embarrass us? We'll make her an example. Find a way to shut her down, no mercy, no second chances. And then the one that sent an audible gasp rolling through the courtroom like a shockwave. She thinks because she's a congresswoman and black, she's untouchable. Remind her she's not. Make it hurt. The words glowed on the screen, monstrous and undeniable. A raw silence settled over the room. The air itself seemed to pull away from their lungs. Judge Trenga leaned forward, squinting slightly as if willing the letters to rearrange themselves into something less damning. But they didn't. They stayed, black and blunt against the white background, spelling out the quiet part that was never meant to be spoken aloud. Jasmine sat back, her hands resting calmly on the table. But inside her chest, something ancient and furious and vindicated howled against the walls they had tried so hard to build around her. She had known. She had always known. But now they all knew too. And there was no one knowing it. The defense attorney stood and requested an immediate halt to proceedings in light of the new evidence. The prosecution tried to object, tried to spin, tried to reframe, but their voices sounded tinny, pathetic, in a room where the truth had already detonated. Judge Trenga's hand gripped the armrest of his chair so tightly that the skin at his knuckles turned white. For a man so practiced at control, so careful in his every movement, the betrayal in his body language was unmistakable. He didn't know what to do. He opened his mouth, closed it, shifted his gaze to the prosecution table, then back to the evidence screen. Finally, his gavel came down, not with authority, but with the exhausted finality of a boxer throwing in the towel. "This court will enter a recess," Trenga said, his voice low and strained, barely containing the storm surging beneath it. He didn't meet Jasmine's eyes, not because he refused, but because he couldn't. Because once you see the truth stripped naked of excuses, it demands something most men in power aren't prepared to give: shame. The room erupted into a chaos of movement, reporters scrambling, prosecutors whispering in urgent, panicked clusters, defense lawyers gathering papers with hands that shook from something other than fear. But Jasmine remained seated for a few heartbeats longer, her body still, her mind whirring. She had won nothing yet. But the ground beneath their feet had shifted, and this time it was them scrambling to keep their balance. And when the court reconvened, it wasn't order that returned to the room. It was the quiet, heavy weight of unfinished reckoning, waiting for someone brave enough to speak what everyone now knew, but dared not admit. Jasmine Crockett rose from her chair without fanfare, without rustling papers or whispered counsel from her team. There was no speech to read, no carefully crafted statement vetted by strategists. She rose because there was nothing left to do but stand. And in that standing, she claimed a kind of power that no title and no verdict could grant or take away. She adjusted the cuffs of her simple black blazer with a quick, efficient motion, the kind of gesture someone makes when they are preparing to walk into something bigger than themselves, and refusing to flinch. She walked down the aisle of the courtroom floor, her steps unhurried, her back straight, her eyes forward. Every heel strike echoed softly across the tile, like the ticking of a clock winding down towards something inevitable. She felt the eyes on her, the jurors, the journalists, the clerks, even the marshals standing like statues by the door. She carried them all with her, not as burdens, but as witnesses. Witnesses to the kind of moment that history tries very hard to forget, and that justice, when it is real, cannot afford to ignore. When she reached the center of the courtroom, she stopped, not directly at the defense podium, not seeking proximity to the judge's towering bench. She stood where the air was clearest, where no structure shielded her and no formality could distort her voice. She looked up toward Judge Trenga, not as an inferior looking toward power, but as an equal meeting another human being across the unbridgeable distance of choice. And she waited. No lawyer prompted her, no bailiff rushed her. For a moment that stretched impossibly long, she was simply there, a figure of defiance, of exhaustion, of relentless belief. When she spoke, it was not with volume or anger. It was not the voice of a rallying cry or a battle hymn. It was something deeper, a voice born from nights sitting alone at a kitchen table, reading files that screamed for justice, from mornings waking up knowing that telling the truth might destroy her life and choosing to do it anyway. "If I must be punished for speaking the truth," she said, her voice low but ringing clear in the great hollow of the courtroom. Then so be it. There was no tremor in her words, no rush to spill them out. Each syllable was placed carefully, like stones paving a path only she had dared to walk. But if this court cannot protect the truth, she continued, her hands steady at her sides, then what is it even for? The words didn't crash down like a storm. They settled like dust after a collapse, filling every crevice, touching every silent space, impossible to sweep away. Nobody moved, nobody coughed. Nobody so much as shifted in their seat. The power of what she said wasn't in the force of her delivery. It was in the unbearable simplicity of it. A statement that laid bare not just the failures of one courtroom, but the rot hollowing out an entire system built on promises it no longer intended to keep. Judge Trenga sat motionless for a long time. For once, he didn't reach for the gavel. He didn't clear his throat or adjust his papers or glance at the clock in that subtle, tyrannical way judges use to remind defendants that their time was being borrowed. He just sat there, looking at her. And in that looking, something cracked, not in Jasmine, but in him. For the first time, and perhaps the last, Judge Trenga seemed to see her not through the prism of his own assumptions, not through the lens of political posture or racial bias or institutional arrogance, but simply as another human being who had refused to lie when the world had demanded it. He didn't speak. He didn't offer an apology or rebuke. He did something infinitely smaller and infinitely more revealing. He nodded, just once, barely a movement at all, but enough. That single nod from the bench did not carry the weight of a verdict, but it cracked open the door for one. And when the court returned the next day, it was no longer a question of whether injustice had occurred. It was a question of what the system would dare do now that it had been caught. The next morning, the air around the Alexandria Federal Courthouse crackled with something different. Not the usual tense expectation of another procedural hearing, not the cold indifference of bureaucracy grinding forward, but something sharper, rawer, harder to contain. Justice, once an abstract idea carefully draped in formality, now felt dangerous, immediate, and alive. Crowds gathered outside in the gray morning light, their breath fogging in the cold, their eyes locked on the heavy stone facade as if willing it to crumble under the weight of what was about to happen. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with a low, volatile energy. Reporters whispered not out of politeness, but because the truth had made them cautious. Lawyers shuffled papers they no longer believed would matter. Even the court security officers, normally rigid as statues, seemed looser at their posts, as if unsure whether they were guarding a courthouse or the scene of a coming confession. Judge Trenga entered later than usual. No announcement, no flourish, just the slow, heavy footsteps of a man who understood too late that the ground he had defended so stubbornly had shifted beneath him. He settled behind the bench with the careful movements of someone carrying something fragile and already cracked. He didn't waste time. He didn't offer a preamble or hide behind legal jargon. When he spoke, his voice was low, stripped of the effortless authority he once wore, like a second skin. After review of the additional evidence presented, he said, pausing longer than necessary between each phrase, this court finds that material evidence, critical to the defense, was deliberately withheld. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, an organic sound, half gasp, half release, as if the walls themselves exhaled in response. Judge Trenga continued, tightening his hands on the bench as if bracing himself against the truth coming out of his own mouth. In light of these revelations, he said, his voice now clipped, tired, this court has no choice but to vacate the proceedings against Representative Jasmine Crockett. He said her name fully without the dismissive Ms. he had used so often before, a small detail, a massive shift. The case is dismissed, effective immediately. The words hit the room like a physical blow, not because they were shouted, not because they were delivered with drama, but because they were final, irrevocable. No appeals, no retrials, no second chances for the prosecution to dress up old lies in new language. Jasmine sat frozen for a long second, the words folding over her like a wave she wasn't ready for. Not because she didn't believe she had earned them, But because survival after so much war never feels clean, it feels raw. It feels like standing in the middle of a battlefield littered with the wreckage of everything you had to burn through just to breathe. Around her, her legal team erupted in whispers. Relief, disbelief, exhaustion colliding all at once. Reporters bolted for the exits, phones clamped to their ears, shouting headlines that would be carried across the nation before Jasmine even rose from her seat. Cameras flashed like lightning as they scrambled to capture the moment history quietly shifted its weight from one side to the other. Judge Trenga wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, his voice gaining a brittle edge, each word carrying the weight of a system trying to salvage what little dignity it had left. Furthermore, he said, clearing his throat against the pressure building in the room, this court refers the conduct related to this case, including the mishandling of evidence, to the Department of Justice's Office of Professional Responsibility for immediate investigation. No one clapped. No one cheered. The words landed not as a celebration, but as an indictment. Not of Jasmine Crockett, but of the very machine that had tried to crush her. Jasmine stood slowly, not rushing, not gloating. She rose because it was time. Her body ached, not from the day's battle, but from months of carrying a fight too heavy for one person to bear. She straightened her blazer, smoothed invisible creases in her skirt, the small movements grounding her in the reality of the moment. When she turned toward the bench, she didn't smile. She didn't offer gratitude. She simply nodded once, silent acknowledgement, silent endurance, and met Trenga's eyes one final time. This time, he looked away first. The courtroom buzzed with movement, prosecutors whispering frantically, defense attorneys packing their files, security scanning the exits with nervous glances. But Jasmine stood in the eye of the storm, utterly still, the weight of the moment folding around her like a second skin. She hadn't won in the way people like to imagine victories happen. No banners, no fireworks. But she had survived. And sometimes survival against a system built to erase you is the loudest kind of triumph. She gathered her belongings. Nothing grand, just a worn leather briefcase, a stack of papers, a pen given to her by a mentor who once told her, "Your words will be your armor someday." She walked out of the defense area without ceremony, her steps unhurried, her head high. Around her eyes followed, not with pity, not with fear, with something else, with recognition. Recognition that whatever narrative had been written about her, whatever labels they had tried to hang around her neck, criminal, agitator, traitor, none of them had stuck. What remained was the one thing they could neither erase nor claim, a woman who had told the truth and stood still when the world tried to bury her for it. Outside, the sky was still gray, heavy with unshed rain, but Jasmine didn't rush to cover herself. She paused for a moment on the steps of the courthouse, breathing in the sharp, cold air. Crowds gathered beyond the police barricades, a sea of faces blurred by camera flashes and shouting questions. But Jasmine wasn't walking out to meet the cameras. She was walking out into something far bigger. The raw, battered, trembling idea that justice, though slow and flawed and painfully human, could still be wrestled back from the hands of those who would bend it for their own comfort. She didn't wave. She didn't gesture. She just walked, head high, shoulders square, through the flashing lights and the shouting voices, into a world that had tried to erase her and failed. Because in the end, Jasmine Crockett hadn't just survived the trial. She had survived the system, and she had forced it for one searing moment to remember what it was supposed to serve. Not power, not fear, truth. The court had dismissed her case, but the aftershocks of what Jasmine forced into the light were just beginning. And this time, they would not be contained inside four marble walls. In the days that followed, the quiet unraveling of power began in earnest. What started as murmurs behind closed doors turned into public demands for accountability. The Department of Justice, under growing scrutiny, announced an internal review into the handling of federal contracts with private prison companies. It wasn't a gesture of goodwill. It was a desperate attempt to stay ahead of the tidal wave that Jasmine's case had unleashed. Under pressure from Congress and relentless media coverage, The Securities and Exchange Commission was dragged into the widening investigation, its own practices questioned in a way not seen in decades. Reports surfaced of audit failures, overlooked abuses, rubber-stamped deals that funneled millions into the pockets of private contractors while silencing the prisoners trapped inside their walls. Subpoenas were issued, whistleblowers emerged. The same offices that had once branded Jasmine a criminal now scrambled to clean their own house before it collapsed under them. But the truth had its own momentum now. It no longer needed her to push it forward. Inside the courtroom where it had all started, Judge Trenga reconvened one final time. Not to pass judgment on Jasmine Crockett, but to acknowledge something larger, something more dangerous to the system than any individual defendant could ever be. He sat heavier in his chair than before, the lines in his face deeper, his movements slower, less certain. The room was packed to the rafters, press, activists, political figures, even junior staffers who had slipped in just to witness what history might look like when it was forced to humble itself. Jasmine sat quietly among her team, her face calm, unreadable, but her very presence reshaped the air around her. She didn't need to speak anymore. The facts spoke louder. Trenga adjusted his microphone, but for a moment no sound came out. He cleared his throat, and then finally his voice filled the room, not with the clipped certainty it once carried, but with something heavier, something earned. "The Department of Justice," he said, pausing, measuring each word, "and the Securities and Exchange Commission are hereby directed to conduct comprehensive reviews of all contracts, communications, and oversight activities pertaining to the federal use of private correctional facilities." The statement, clinical on its surface, detonated across the room like a bomb. It wasn't just an investigation. It was a public confession. The system was no longer above suspicion. Judge Trenga sat back slightly, folding his hands over the worn wood of the bench. He looked out over the courtroom, not at any one person, but at the space where law and truth were supposed to meet. His voice, when it came again, was lower now, rougher, as if each word was being dragged from some place deeper than duty. "Justice," he said, and his voice caught slightly, just for a moment, enough that those closest to him heard it, "isn't about who wins." The room was dead silent, not a shuffle, not a cough. Even the court reporter's keys stilled for a breath. "It's about who refuses," he paused, the words heavy in his throat, "who refuses to surrender to the lie." The sentence didn't rise into a crescendo. It fell like a hammer wrapped in cloth, sinking deep into every heart in that room. He didn't look at Jasmine directly. He didn't have to. The words found her anyway, found everyone who had watched and judged and doubted. Because they weren't just about her. They were about every system that demanded silence in the face of wrongdoing. Every courtroom that traded truth for convenience. Every official who told themselves the machinery was too big to fight, too complicated to question. Jasmine inhaled slowly, feeling the weight of those words settle into her bones. Not as a burden, but as something far older, far more durable. A calling. And though the battle inside that room had ended, she knew the real war, the one for memory, for meaning, for the future, was only just beginning. The court had spoken, and the system had been shaken. But when the cameras turned toward Jasmine, demanding to know what came next, she chose a path that none of them could predict, and none of them were ready for. For weeks after the trial ended, Jasmine Crockett's name surged through the headlines like a wildfire nobody could control. Offers poured in from every direction. Senate seats, gubernatorial runs, National Party endorsements. The political world circled her like a prize they hadn't earned but desperately wanted to claim. She was the symbol they needed, the proof they could point to when the next scandal broke, when the next injustice flared. A success story, a redemption arc. A way to pretend the system worked after all. But Jasmine saw through it. She saw the hands reaching for her not to lift her up, but to tame her, to wrap her in the velvet ropes of respectability, to turn her into a polished statue they could point at instead of listening to the uncomfortable truth she carried. They didn't want her fire. They wanted her silence, repackaged in a nicer suit. And so, when she stepped onto a modest stage one crisp evening in Baltimore, A stage without banners, without confetti, without the endless empty promises of party slogans. She gave them her answer. She didn't read from a teleprompter. She didn't smile for the flashing cameras. She simply looked out over the crowd, young lawyers, activists, students, mothers holding children in their arms, and spoke in that steady, unbreakable voice they had all come to know. "I have been asked if I will run for higher office," she began, her tone calm but slicing clean through the heavy air. "If I will climb the ladders they now pretend were always built for me." She paused, letting the tension coil tighter. "But I am not interested in reaching the top of a broken system just to wave down at the people it was designed to crush." A hush rippled outward. Shock, maybe, or awe, or just the rare silence that falls when truth walks into a room. "I don't want to sit at the head of a rigged table," she continued. "I want to tear it down and build something that belongs to all of us." Somewhere in the crowd, someone gasped. A sound small and involuntary, as if an old dream had just cracked open inside their chest. "I don't want power," Jasmine said, her voice gaining a rougher edge now, pulsing with something deeper. "I want change." And then she dropped the line that would be replayed on a million phones, whispered in 1,000 classrooms, printed in the margins of battered law textbooks for years to come. "I don't want to climb to the top of the system. I want to change the way it treats the people at the bottom." The crowd didn't explode in applause. They stood in a stunned, reverent quiet, as if realizing that they hadn't come to see a politician rise. They had come to see a revolution being born. What Jasmine built afterward didn't make headlines in the way elections and scandals did. It didn't flash across cable news in ticker-tape fonts or trend on social media for cheap clicks. It grew slowly, quietly, like a fire catching in dry fields no one thought could burn. She called it the Foundation for Relentless Justice, a place not of slogans, but of steel. There were no marble lobbies, no polished brass nameplates. The first office was 2 floors above a pawn shop on the east side of town, the air heavy with the smell of old paper and hope fighting to stay alive. But the people who came through its battered doors didn't care about the decor. They came because Jasmine offered them something no elite internship ever could: a battlefield education, a weapon forged from law and truth. Young black lawyers, Latino public defenders, Native American advocates, immigrant organizers, they came from places the system pretended not to see. They came with stories written in eviction notices, bail bonds, deportation orders. They came angry. They came afraid. They came burning. And Jasmine taught them how to sharpen that fire into something the courtrooms couldn't ignore. They studied constitutional law at night, argued mock trials in the mornings, ripped apart real appellate briefs on weekends. They learned how to take a hostile cross-examination and turn it into a knife that bled the truth out into the open. Jasmine taught them not just how to speak in court, but when to stay silent, when silence itself could become a hammer pounding against injustice. She didn't tell them it would be fair. She didn't tell them it would be quick. She told them the truth, that fighting the system meant standing in rooms designed to humiliate them, to ignore them, to erase them, and winning anyway. She told them about the looks they would get, the smirks, the yawns, the polite dismissals. She told them about judges who would call them son or girl without a second thought. She told them about clerks who would accidentally misplace their filings, about court reporters who would conveniently forget to record their objections. And she told them exactly what to do when it happened. Stand up straighter, speak clearer, fight harder, because every time they refused to disappear, every time they refused to break, they were teaching the system something it did not want to learn, that it could no longer operate in the dark, that it could no longer win just by outlasting those it sought to silence. 5 years later, Jasmine sat in a folding chair in the back of a crowded municipal courtroom. No press, no cameras, just a young attorney, barely 26, straight out of Jasmine's program, standing at the defense table, arguing for the rights of an undocumented worker caught in a citywide sweep. The prosecutor smirked. The judge leaned back with barely concealed impatience. The stenographer didn't bother hiding her sighs, but the young attorney didn't waver, didn't rush, didn't apologize. She planted her feet, raised her voice, made the courtroom listen. And when she finished, the judge, clearly annoyed but unable to deny what had been laid bare, dismissed the charges. Case closed. No headline would report it. No cable news show would mention it. But Jasmine knew. Every battle like that, no matter how small, was a crack spidering across the old foundation. And someday, maybe not today, maybe not even in her lifetime, but someday the whole rotten structure would fall. And when it did, it wouldn't be because someone powerful decided to save the system from itself. It would be because people who were never supposed to matter refused to surrender. Because truth, once carried high enough, long enough, by enough stubborn, unbreakable hands, always eventually wins. But legacies are not made from victories alone. They are built from the scars, the choices, and the endless, grinding refusal to accept that injustice is inevitable. The lesson that survived Jasmine Crockett's trial was not written in the court transcripts. It wasn't preserved in the formal rulings or summarized neatly in newspaper editorials. It lived in the spaces between, in the uneasy glances exchanged by prosecutors who had once been invincible, in the shift of weight among judges who now knew that eyes were watching them differently. It lived in the steady, quiet rise of young attorneys who no longer asked for permission to be heard. It lived in the memory of a woman who did not run when the system turned all its weight against her, who stood where she was supposed to break and forced the truth into the light anyway. The world often teaches people like Jasmine to wait, to believe that if they are patient enough, polite enough, quiet enough, change will come. But the real lesson her story carved into history was sharper, bloodier, more dangerous to those in power. Change does not come for the patient. It comes for those willing to be seen bleeding and standing at the same time. It comes for those willing to become the crack that weakens the whole wall. Justice is not a prize handed down by the powerful. It is a fight waged in the dark, where the odds are bad and the rules are written against you. Justice is fought for by people who know they may not live to see the system change, but fight anyway because surrendering would be a second death, slower and more complete than any defeat at the hands of an unjust court. Jasmine's story was never about a courtroom win. It wasn't about beating the odds. It was about refusing to lie, even when the cost of truth was everything. When Trenga dropped his gavel that final time and muttered his broken admission, "Justice isn't who wins, it's who refuses to surrender to the lie." It wasn't a victory speech. It was a confession that for all its power, the system had been brought to its knees, not by armies or politicians, but by a single woman who would not play her assigned role. Because the real danger to injustice isn't anger. It isn't noise, it's stubbornness. The stubbornness to tell the truth so many times that the lies can no longer breathe. That is what Jasmine Crockett taught anyone willing to see, that sometimes survival is the loudest form of protest, that sometimes standing still in the line of fire says more than any shouted slogan, that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is refuse to be erased. The lesson was brutal in its simplicity. Power maintains itself by making you believe you're alone, but you are never alone when you stand for truth. Every act of courage becomes a signal fire for the next fighter. Every refusal to bend becomes another stone in the foundation of something better. The lesson was costly. Jasmine lost friends, lost opportunities, lost the comforting lie that if you play by the rules long enough, you'll be protected. But what she gained was something rarer, something harder than any political victory. She gained the certainty that even if they took everything else from her, they could not take away the proof that one person, armed only with truth, could make the wall shake. In a world that rewards silence, Jasmine Crockett's greatest legacy is not that she spoke. It's that she dared to stay standing after they tried to silence her, and that she built 1,000 voices where once there had been only hers. And for every courtroom still stacked against the voiceless, for every gavel that tries to bury the truth under a pile of procedures, for every whispered order to make an example of those who dare to speak, Jasmine's story stands like a lit fuse, burning towards something inevitable. Because when enough people refuse to surrender to the lie, the system cannot survive it. Because the real measure of justice is not in who holds the gavel. It is in who refuses to kneel. But knowing the lesson is not enough. If Jasmine's fight taught anything, It's that the truth demands more than witness. It demands warriors. The fight Jasmine faced did not end when the gavel fell. It does not end because her story was told or because the courtrooms were forced momentarily to remember what they were built for. It continues in every overlooked report, every silenced voice, every locked door that tries to keep justice out and power safely hidden inside. It continues because systems built on injustice do not crumble from guilt alone. They fall when people stand up one by one and refuse to let them keep breathing lies into the walls. You do not need a law degree to fight. You do not need a title or permission or even certainty. You need only what Jasmine had, the stubborn belief that silence is complicity and that truth once spoken must be defended by action. Start where you are. Stand when you're told to sit. Question when you're told to accept. Refuse the easy lies, even when they dress themselves up in fine language and hollow promises. Vote like it matters because it does. Organize like survival depends on it because it does. Teach your children the truth before the world teaches them fear. The system hopes you will forget Jasmine's story. It counts on your exhaustion, your doubt, your hesitation. But every voice raised against injustice makes it harder for the old lies to hold. Every refusal to surrender is a crack in the wall. Every small act of courage is another weight dragging corruption closer to collapse. So choose, not tomorrow, not after the next election, not after someone else leads first. Choose today. Choose now. Be the crack they fear. Because the future will not be built by those who waited. It will be built by those who stood, who spoke, who fought, and who, like Jasmine Crockett, refused to surrender to the lie. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.